Hello, and welcome to Virginia Cooperative Extension Soil Webinar Series, May 29th, 2015. My name is Dr. John Galbraith, and I'm a Soil Information Extension Specialist at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. Today we will be discussing soil organic matter. The webinar explains soil organic matter and soil carbon types and content of each, and the response of these materials to management. The topics for today's webinar are listed. And these are today's learning objectives. Well, let's start with a little bit of background information. Soil organic matter, and we'll just call this organic matter from now on, occurs in various states of decomposition. When it's stable in the soil, after it's undergone the initial weathering and decomposition by microbes, we call it humus. So the stable fraction is called humus. The original material is called organic matter. Only a portion of organic matter is actually carbon, but the two values are closely related: organic carbon and organic matter. Almost all soils also contain inorganic carbon, and typically that's found as calcium carbonate, and this is more common out west than it is here in the eastern United States. Exceptions, in other words, which soils might not have inorganic carbon, would be those found in very humid regions, such as we have here in the east, or excessively leached soils, which we also have here in the east. So for the most part, the inorganic carbon part in Virginia is very, very low, except maybe over limestone soils. And that would be right close to the limestone itself. So essentially, total carbon is composed of the organic carbon fraction and the inorganic carbon fraction. So now we have some terms laid out, and that allows us to proceed with the rest of the talk. Well, let's take a look at the composition. Now, a lot of the figures in today's talk are taken from Brady and Weil, the 14th edition of the Nature and Property of Soils. In this chart, we learn that organic matter is really about 75% water and 25% dry matter. That's actually a little bit less water than we have in our own bodies. And if we look and break down that dry matter and look in the lower left pie chart, we can see that cellulose makes up almost half of the compounds in the dry matter. Almost half of the mass in the dry matter is cellulose, so it's by far the most common. If we look at the material on an elemental basis in the lower right hand pie chart, we see that carbon makes up about 42%, and ash, which are other constituents such as phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, and other elements, makes up about 8%. So about half of the dry matter is made up of nutrients. The other half is made up of oxygen and hydrogen. Well, what is the origin of the organic matter? And organic matter has many terms, and it has been also called litter, residue, manure, tissue. Any of those terms work. If you see those, you can interchange those for organic matter. But essentially, it's made up of dead roots and other plant tissue, leaves, stems, stalks, made up of dead animal bodies and excretions, so manures, urine, and then dead bodies of burrowing animals. Now, the graphic at the bottom shows a variety of microorganisms, mites, uh, all kinds of creatures, shredders, and moles, all kinds of creatures that live in the soil. And when these live in the soil, when they die, then their bodies become part of the organic matter pool. We also have exudates and leachates from living biomass. So um, these materials are gel-like often, or they're enzymes. And then we have microbes, both living and dead. Well, what factors affect the decomposition and mineralization rate? And I guess we should start by defining mineralization, and that's the conversion of organic nutrients to inorganic forms. So, as organic matter is decomposed by microbes, then nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, potassium, other elements are released as mineral elements. So, the minerals that were taken up by the soil and incorporated into the plant tissue and then possibly passed on to the bodies of animals, insects, worms, and other creatures, then now it's reverting back from an organic, it was then incorporated into their organic tissues, and mineralization returns it back to an inorganic mineral form. Now, the decomposition and mineralization may take from days to years to happen. And there are two broad factors that influence this: the environmental conditions in the soil and the quality of the organic matter that's been added. Well, let's take a look at this chart. The figure shows an annual cycle with fresh residue addition at the start, followed by a rapid rise in microbial activity, and this is shown in the upper chart. Residue is added at the beginning of the cycle, and it proceeds for about 1 year. The microbes at the peak activity may be short on soil nitrogen, and so sometimes they borrow nitrogen from the soil itself in order to complete their decomposition. This is called the priming effect. And one effect that it can have on plants is that there can be a decrease in the amount of nitrogen available in the soil during that time. So sometimes plants can experience a little bit of chlorosis during this time period. As the original organic material is broken down, it first moves down into a pool of easily digested compounds and microbial biomass, and that would be the center portion of the lower slide. And then the remaining later in the season moves into the stable soil humus pool, and that happens at the end of the first season. Well, decomposition and mineralization take place in the soil, so the location of organic matter is important. So is the tissue that's being added on top of the soil, or is it incorporated in the soil? That makes a difference on the rate. Is there an attachment to clay or iron or calcium or aluminum? Because if the organic material has one of these compounds or minerals or elements attached to it, then it will have limited decomposition. Microbes have a hard time breaking down material that has aluminum, calcium, iron, or clay attached to it. And clay coatings also may protect the organic matter from access to the microbes. All right, what about particle size? Well, the smaller particles are more rapidly shredded and decomposed. So we start with a large leaf or a corn stalk, and as it's broken down into smaller particles, the particle size surface area increases. The particle size decreases, the surface area increases, and that speeds up the decomposition. We have digestibility, and we'll see a chart on that in just a minute. We have the carbon and nitrogen ratio, and that makes a big difference. When that ratio is either too high or too low, then we can have limited decomposition. And we also have to have other nutrients in the soil as well. So phosphorus is required by microbes for energy and their cell wall components. And so if you don't have enough phosphorus in the soil, that will limit the decomposition rate of the organic matter. Well, here's the chart that we talked about, and it lists the digestibility of organic compounds. And so the most easily decomposed and rapidly decomposed are the ones at the top of the chart: sugars, starches, simple proteins. And they increase through crude proteins, hemicellulose, cellulose, which again was the most abundant fraction, right? 42% of the soil, of the organic material is cellulose. And then we have fats, waxes, and other compounds. And then this is the material number 6 and 7 that turn into the humus fraction of the soil: lignins and phenol compounds, and these are polyphenols actually, and then biochar. So the rate becomes extremely slow for as you get lower down on the chart. Well, what about the organic matter quality here? High quality organic matter has a carbon to nitrogen ratio somewhere between 5 to 1 and 40 to 1. And microbes, the bodies of microbes themselves range from 5 to 10 to 1. And polyphenolic materials have lower quality because they directly inhibit the lives of decomposers. And so the content, if the material contains polyphenols, it's just going to prevent its own decomposition. And high lignin content lowers the quality because it is very resistant to microbial degradation. It's primarily broken down by fungi and is partially hydrophobic. Well, here's a chart that shows the carbon to nitrogen ratio of several soils. And ideally, recall that the ideal ratio is 5 to 1 to 40 to 1. If we get higher than that, the material is said to be nitrogen limited. And if we get a lower ratio than 5 to 1, then it's said to be carbon limited. Now, things like biosolids and sludge are already decomposed, and microbes tend to bring the carbon to nitrogen ratio closer to their body composition because they are the major source of food for other microbes. So the digested municipal sewage sludge is what I'm calling biosolids. And you can see that the ratio is already low because it's undergone previous decomposition. The rest of the materials are fresh inputs. Okay, the management effects that we can see here: organic matter in forested O and A horizons have less proportional nitrogen than grassland soils and subsoils. So the carbon in these materials is at a stable level. The carbon to nitrogen in the O horizons is still being broken down, but it's in that stable condition once it becomes part of the soil. Okay, this is a figure from the book again, and here we see the carbon to nitrogen ratio of high carbon organic materials starts very high and gradually decreases over the course of an annual cycle. So it starts out above that 40 to 1 ratio, and then it gradually drops to below that 40-to-1 ratio where it becomes more stable. The nitrate also builds during later in the season, but in the early part of the season when residue is just added, then we get a depression in nitrate levels, and that again is because of the need for nitrogen to balance out the high carbon amount in the freshly added residue. So we add the residue, it's high in carbon, low in nitrogen, and then the nitrate in the soil actually may get depressed, or the priming effect takes place and nitrate is used in the decomposition process when the microbial population gets very high. Well, what about low carbon residues? Well, this is an example of low carbon residue, and here we have a very tiny nitrate depression, and in fact we start to build nitrate very rapidly in the soil. The reason is because the material that's added, the fresh residue that's added, is low in carbon, and so the carbon to nitrogen ratio is already well below the 40-to-1 level, and so the microbes are able to decompose the material without really having to borrow much from the soil at all. And then in the process of breaking down organic material, more nitrate is released to the soil. So this is actually probably the a better type of residue to add, something that's already low in carbon if you're worried about nitrate depression. The concern of adding low carbon residues is you have to be careful not to add too much, or you have to adjust your fertilizer rate, because you can see how much is added to the soil, and if more is added than can be taken up, then it's going to end up in the groundwater. Well, let's take a quiz. Which is a preferable addition to a field or pasture, low carbon organic matter or high carbon organic matter? Well, the best answer is A. And with the low carbon source, then we have an immediate availability to microbes, and we also do not have a drawdown in the soil nitrogen or nitrate levels. All right. Well, humus is really two major components or constituents. So we have non-humic substances and humic substances, and let's take a look at the structure of this material. The non-humic substances make up about 30%. These are the ones that are not very resistant to decomposition. So sugars, starch, proteins, cellulose types. That was numbers 1 through 5 on the previous chart. And here's an example. This is glucose, and you can see all the carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. Basically, we think of sugars as being a CHO type of composition, but these are single bonds, and these are easily broken down by microbes. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons in a ring shape with an oxygen, and that bond can be broken right here by the microbes very easily. Well, humic substances make up 70% of the soil organic matter, by far the dominant amount. These are the ones that end up as stable compounds. They're resistant to decomposition, and we have polyphenols shown on the lower left. And what you see here is these rings where we have shared bonds and double bonds, and those are very difficult to break down. Here we actually see a glucose molecule attached, but these larger rings are the ones that are so difficult to break, these bonds. This is a picture of lignin in the center lower part, And again, you can see how complex, how much branching there is, and how many double bonds and shared bonds there are. And then this is a graphic showing biochar, and biochar is typically less than 60% carbon, but we have carbon and oxygen, and they form these very stable rings, very thin layer, and this material is actually called graphene. Let's talk about biochar for just a minute. Here we see a picture of biochar. It's made of graphene. It's very resistant to decay. It also retains, if you look in the lower left hand corner, you can see that it retains the structure of the tissue, of the original tissue. And that's very, very critical, because look at the surface area of this type of material. That's one thing that gives it such a desirable characteristic. All right. The biochar has many plant and soil benefits, but you have to proceed with caution, because not all biochar is alike. There are many types, and they have variable properties, and some of those properties are not that desirable in soils, or the material has to be applied carefully at carefully regulated rates. And you can see on the lower right, this is a cacao plant. This is the production of chocolate, and this farmer is adding biochar around the base of the tree to increase the physical and chemical properties of the soil, to improve those. Well, here's a graph that shows the fate of organic material. About a year after it's added, 60 to 80% of it is going into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Other materials is retained in biomass. So about 5% is in living biomass, soil organisms and plant materials, living materials. The material that breaks down and becomes stable in the soil is going to make up the humus, and that's going to be 15 to 35% of the soil. And it's made up again of, I think we said 30% of that humus is going to be the easily broken down material. That's not going to last very long, but the material that's more complex, the polyphenols, the lignin, and the biochar, that's going to last a lot longer, and that makes up about 70%. Well, that leads us to the discussion of pools, and that just means fraction. And we have three fractions, and that's the active pool, the slow pool, and the passive pool. So this is once we get into the humus fraction. Then how long does it last? Well, that active is the material that's broken down really rapidly, 10 to 20% of the total organic matter. The slow pool is broken down a little bit more slowly. This is the lignin and the humic substances. And then the passive pool is clay, humus that's attached to clay, humus that's coated by clay, and oxides, or trapped inside of aggregates. And that entrapment inside of water stable aggregates is one of the best ways we have to increase the carbon content of our soils. And so forming aggregates, and water stable aggregates even better, is a very good way to improve our carbon content in the soil. Well, biochar falls into this passive pool, and that makes up, again, 60 to 80% of the total. And this graphic shows those three different pools and their average length. The active pool, 1 to 2 years, it's gone. Sometimes not even lasting 1 year. The slow pool may last, for a couple of decades to in the hundreds of years. But then the passive pool is the one that lasts for longer than our lifetimes and builds up in the soil and is stable. Well, this is a picture that shows the course of organic matter over a number of years of time. So the other graphics were showing the cycle within 1 year. Now we're looking at it over multiple years, and you can see that the passive pool stays pretty constant over time, but it's the slow pool and the active pool that are very dynamic, and of course the plant residue is very dynamic. So if we had an equilibrium level that had a certain amount of tissue, live tissue, uh, active organic matter, slow, and passive, and we had an equilibrium level up here, and then we started cultivating. Well, we start to break aggregates open and start to really to accelerate the decomposition. And so, the plant residues break down faster because they're more available to the microbes, and the active material, if the microbe population goes up, then we have uh, more breakdown of the really easily broken down materials, and then the slower pool comes under attack as well. And so these materials really decrease over time. Now, if we change the management system from this would be conventional agricultural practices, a lot of tillage, not much residue being returned to the soil. If we change that and implement no-till or residue management, then we can actually improve the total organic matter in the soil. Again, we're not going to change the passive material too much, but we could increase it a bit. But we can start to rebuild the slow pool and the active pool and the residue pool. And this will continue to rise, but it probably will never reach that original equilibrium level. That equilibrium is a lost equilibrium. So this would be more like the new equilibrium that we could maintain if we're going to continue cultivating. Well, speaking of the carbon balance, and that's what we've been talking about, is maybe increasing. How do we increase the amount of carbon in the soil, or even just decrease the losses? Well, first we have to understand the balance and where are the gains. Well, the gains are from organic matter additions, and this can be manure, sludge, biosolids, compost, plant tissues, plant residue. But the losses are from CO2 through decomposition, plant uptake of materials, plant removal, and then any erosion that takes place because of excess removal of residue, or dissolved organic carbon losses. Dissolved organic carbon is water soluble carbon, and it can be lost through deep leaching of the soil. Well, what are the natural controls on organic matter? Let's understand the natural and the human controls on organic matter, and then we can understand what our management choices might be. So these are things that we cannot really control. We talk about grassland soils versus forest soils, and the grassland soils are darker. They have more of the humic acid type, not humus, but humic acid, and they have more biochar, and they also have biocycling of calcium, and the calcium stabilizes the organic matter. So biocycling is when plant roots bring nutrients to the surface, and that's what grasses do. Now there are a few forest trees that do biocycling, but not very many. Uh, some maples and a few other trees do this, a few of the oaks, but most of them do not. So there's very little biocycling of calcium in a forest soil. In fact, most forest soils have very little calcium to begin with. But in forest soils, we have lighter colored acids, and they're called fulvic acids for the most part. And so we just don't get the dark colors in these forested soils. Well, another factor that influences organic matter levels is natural. When wetlands, we have saturation and depletion of oxygen. We get anaerobic conditions, and that ends up with higher organic matter and lower decomposition. Now, that would be true unless we drain the wetland, and if we drain it, then it's a different story. And let's look at climate too. Cooler temperatures, moisture climates, those have slower decomposition rates, and so we build up organic matter in the soil over time. And here's a map that shows the combined effect of temperature and moisture. So moisture increases from the west to the east. The moisture also increases along the west coast because it's the first set of mountains to capture moisture coming off the Pacific. High elevations also have more carbon than lower elevations. So more moisture along the west coast and at high elevations in the Rockies, and then more moisture as we go from west to east and we pick up moisture, and that ends up with higher carbon in those areas. Now notice that in the upper Midwest we picked up moisture, but what we also did was we decreased the temperature, because as we go north the temperatures decrease, and so in New England and in the upper Midwest then we start to increase in carbon because of lower temperatures and lower decomposition. The reason that we have high carbon right along the coastline of the eastern U.S. is because of the wetness. The soil is so wet then that we get limited decomposition. Well, texture plays a part in organic matter. Sandy soils have high losses of carbon dioxide. They have very few exchange sites, so they really cannot hold on to humus. Even when it's put into the soil, most of it leaches out. Clayier soils have fewer losses because they retain the organic matter. The clay binds to the humus and coats the humus and protects it. So soil organic matter increases as clay content increases. And that's generally true. And then drainage. Poorly drained wet soils retain soil organic matter relative to drier soils because anaerobic decomposition is less efficient than aerobic decomposition. So soils that are well drained have a lot of oxygen in them, and so we get aerobic decomposition, and it fairly well leaves us with a smaller soil organic carbon percentage. Even at the surface it won't be as high. Soils that are wetter have much higher carbon right at the surface, and they retain that carbon uh, content throughout because of the anaerobic nature of these wet soils. There's just not a way to get much oxygen down in these soils, so carbon really has a difficult time being decomposed in an oxygen-free environment. Well, how do we manage organic matter? We can maintain a continuous supply of high quality inputs, and this would be meaning inputs on a regular basis. And this keeps the insects and the microbes happy. We can rotate crops. We can use cover crops to increase the diversity of microbes, reduce pests, diseases, and parasites. There are so many advantages. We can manage the crop residues to prevent erosion, and we can count on mineralization of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, carbon, calcium. Other elements can be released from the organic matter, and with nitrate we might even get up to 70 pounds of nitrogen equivalent per year, plus some potassium and phosphorus. So we need to take this into account when calculating a fertilizer budget. Well, now, what other ways can humans manage the organic matter? We talked about the natural controls. Now we've started talking about the human controls. And we really, going back to that graph that showed that once cultivation started on the soil that we dropped from that original equilibrium level. Well, most soils in Virginia have about 2 to 10% organic matter, and with the higher end of this range is in the wetter soils like wetlands. We can, if we were able to raise the organic matter content by even 2%, and that's about 1% organic carbon, that would be an amazing accomplishment. We can do that by residue management, no-till, and other practices. Or we can add manure, biochar, biosolids, other compost, other materials that are already high in carbon. But you can waste a lot of time, energy, and money if you think that you can try to force organic matter to extremely high levels. You're not going to get them above their original equilibrium point, but so, you know, trying to aim for a very, very high increase in organic matter that is permanent increase is just not realistic. 2% increase would be realistic, and that can be done by wise management. And wise management can also help us minimize the losses, and that's probably minimizing the losses is the first step, and then adding organic carbon is the second. Well, we also have to have adequate nitrogen in the soil if we're going to uh, sequester or store significant amounts of carbon. If you don't have nitrogen, the carbon dioxide losses dominate. Uh, Plants and microbes continue to respire, and when they do that, they release carbon dioxide. But microbes can't break down much additional organic matter if they don't have the proper carbon to nitrogen balance. And we have plant uptake and complete residue removal decreases the soil organic matter levels. And this is especially true when annual crops are grown rather than perennials, and if the litter is removed rather than being recycled. So, what can humans do here? Well, they can make sure there's adequate nitrogen in the soil, and you can manage the residues and not completely remove the plant parts. Well, soils and climate change, how do those two relate? We have biofuel growth, processing, and combustion. That's a new hot topic, biofuels, and we're talking about growing switchgrass, loblolly pine, and using those for fuel production rather than biodiesel, rather than for wood or for grazing. But it's unclear whether or not we actually get a net increase or a net removal of carbon dioxide and methane through these processes. The jury is still out. We're not sure. And as far as draining and filling wetlands, it's really not clear whether the high sequestration rate and storage of carbon in wetlands offsets the natural emissions of carbon dioxide and methane. Wetlands are the biggest source of methane. The wetlands also release nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas. And you can see the impact of the various greenhouse gases here. In the parts that come from the soil are in blue. So this piece of the pie represents the total methane released, and you can see most of the total methane comes from soil. About half of the carbon dioxide that's released to the atmosphere comes from soil, and most of the nitrous oxide comes from soil. Now the CFCs and the ozone, that's other anthropogenic sources. Let's talk about soil health real quick. We have, the higher organic matter means a steady supply of nutrients, and that's through mineralization. We get lower bulk density and greater porosity. It's easier for roots to grow in the soil when it's not compacted. Organic matter has a very low density, so adding organic matter lowers the total soil density, makes it lighter and fluffier. Higher organic matter means higher water holding because the humus that organic matter breaks down into holds water. Higher organic matter or carbon means better aggregate stability, and we know how beneficial that is. We have more food for microbes. Organic matter provides better biodiversity in the soil, and that's not just microbes, but the other insects, other parts of the food web. Humus, once the organic matter turns into humus, again, we have aggregate formation and stability is increased, water holding, cation exchange capacity, soil mineral weathering rate. In other words, humus actually increases weathering rate and releases minerals from inorganic sources. So not only do we get better mineralization, we get better weathering. And then aluminum toxicity is decreased because the organic matter buffers the pH and it attaches to free aluminum and so makes it less available to plants, less toxic. Well, just another look at the biodiversity through the soil web chain, food web. And these organisms have a checks and balances on each other. And so if we don't have good biodiversity, one or the other populations may get out of control. Nematodes are a good example. If we don't have some of the components like arthropods, mites, and other things, we can get a high amount of nematodes in the soil, and then that could be injurious to the plant. So we need to have the checks and balances by having all of these different levels in the soil and in the soil web. Well, one thing that may be interesting to some of you is the discussion of carbon credits. And there's talk that these are going to be real credits that can be traded in dollar amounts, and right now they actually are happening. This is happening in certain parts of the world, and we can get actually monetary credit for sequestering carbon in the soil, and that's meant to offset carbon emissions from other sources. And they can be traded nationally and internationally because there could be some parts on the earth where we could store carbon, like in wetlands, whereas we may be emitting carbon dioxide through coal plants in areas where there are no wetlands. So maybe they don't have the option to store carbon in their area, so they may purchase wetland storage of carbon from another part of the globe. And all of this should be a good trading system, and it should help people understand that there's always going to be choices about land use management, and that carbon in the soil is better than carbon in the atmosphere. And they they have to just look at the gains and losses and then their management activities and see how they best can be managing the land for benefits for all people as well as for their own economic gain. But how can we greatly increase the amount of carbon stored in the soil? Well, the two ways that I think are easiest is to increase aggregate stability and then adding biochar. Of all the measures, I think those are the two that lend themselves to the longest term protection of carbon from microbial breakdown. And so if we can lock it away inside stable aggregates, then we can increase the carbon content and also protect it from the microbes. But at the same time, we can also have the other more easily decomposed components available to keep the microbes healthy and happy and the plants happy. All right, well, thank you again for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed today's talk. We'll have more webinars later on, and these are going to be available through the Virginia Cooperative Extension webpage. You can look under natural resources and under soil information, and you can download these videos. There have been about 10 produced so far. I have a Facebook page where I post things of interest about soils. I also have a Twitter page, and I'd love for you to follow along and see if there's anything of interest. And then if you have requests about webinars or soil training, please feel free to answer this poll and provide me the information, and then that helps me to target the webinars and then target the field training. All right, well, I hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you at the next webinar.